Gen X is not cold. They are just one of the hardest generations to manipulate. And that is exactly where almost everyone gets them wrong. This is what we are really unpacking here, where that filter came from, how it works, and what it costs them later. People call them cold, distant, hard to read. That is the surface, not the mechanism. A lot of what people call cold in them is actually a nervous system that learned not to trust too fast, not to say too much, and not to hand power to people who have not proven anything. This is not the kind of generation that gets impressed by titles. Not easily. Not the kind that melts because someone sounds important. Not the kind that opens up just because someone performs closeness well. And the more you talk big while doing little, the faster they pull back. Quietly. Clearly. Without making a scene. They just take their trust off the table. And if you miss that filter, you will misread almost every Gen X interaction after that. The problem is, most younger people do not understand where that filter came from. They assume Gen X is emotionally shut down. This was not attitude, it was training. But no, Gen X grew up in a time when a lot of things arrived too early for a child to carry. Empty house, parents at work, let yourself in, take care of yourself, stay out of trouble, learn very early that nobody is guaranteed to be there behind you. That is not just a childhood memory, it is a trust tutorial. And when you learn that lesson too soon, you do not grow into the kind of person who talks a lot about feelings. You grow into the kind of person who watches first, measures competence first, looks for stability first, trusts later. What looks like distance is often just a higher threshold for trust. That is why Gen X has something that is rare now. They respect competence more than charisma. They trust consistency more than chemistry. They listen to fewer words and pay more attention to behavior. To put it plainly, a lot of today's social tactics do not work on them. Status signaling, forced closeness, crowd pressure, acting important, performative morality. A lot of that can move younger people. It mostly raises Gen X's guard. That kind of thing usually does not impress them. It just makes them alert. And this is the part that matters most. Gen X does not reject authority. They reject empty authority. If you are truly capable, they will follow. If you are solid, they will respect you. But if all you have is a title, a performance, or a louder voice than everyone else, they see through it fast. Very fast. Here's the core of it, where that filter came from, why empty authority fails on them, why they can be incredibly reliable and still hard to access, and what that strength quietly costs them later. There is one more thing most people never notice. Their privacy did not come out of nowhere. It was trained by repeated disappointment. Gen X is not just private. They were shaped inside repeated system failure. Family stopped feeling stable. Work stopped feeling loyal. Authority stops sounding trustworthy. After enough of that, promises lose their shine. You start asking a different question. Who can actually do the job? And that is the question running underneath Gen X psychology. Not who sounds the best, not who makes me feel the best, but who is solid enough for me to place trust in. So, if you have ever worked with someone from Gen X and felt like they were hard to read, if you have ever noticed they do not bend easily under social pressure, if you have ever seen them say very little and still get respected anyway, that is not random. It is the result of a certain kind of childhood, a certain kind of instability, and a certain kind of mental conditioning that many younger generations have never fully tasted. Start with the empty house. Start with the child who had to regulate too early. That is where the filter begins. But the empty house was only the beginning. That scene did not happen in a vacuum. It happened during a period when after-school self-care became much more common, and the research is honest about that reality. It was not pure damage. It was not pure strength. Some children became more responsible, some became lonelier, more exposed, and more stressed far too early. So, when Gen X looks unusually self-contained, do not confuse that with style. In many cases, independence was assigned before it was chosen. That is the part people romanticize and miss. And that matters because early self-management changes what your mind starts scanning for. If you had to regulate yourself early, you do not build trust the same way. You watch first, you measure first, you lean later. And once that becomes normal, loud signals start losing value. Charm matters less, confidence matters less, titles matter less. What matters more is simple. Is this person steady, useful, real? And when life feels less stable, competence starts mattering more than charm. That is why Gen X often seems harder to impress and slower to surrender trust. Then stability started failing in the places that were supposed to teach it, first at home, then at work. At home, family stability started cracking. At work, loyalty stopped looking safe. Millions of adults were displaced when plants closed, companies folded, or payrolls were cut. So when Gen X heard, "Follow the rules and everything will work out," reality answered back with something harder. Families broke, companies let people go, systems said one thing and did another. That kind of repetition changes a person. It trains you to separate speech from substance, and promises start sounding less like comfort and more like something that has to be verified. And once that switch flips, performance stops working. That is why Gen X does not really have a problem with authority. They have a problem with empty authority. Give them someone capable, and they can be deeply loyal. Give them someone solid, and they can work with very little drama. But give them a title without skill, a performance without substance, a demand for respect without proof, and the temperature drops fast. If you want a Gen X person's respect, remember this. Show competence before chemistry. Show consistency before closeness. Show substance before status. You do not even need politics to see the pattern. For Gen X, institutions do not get automatic credit, and this is where younger generations misread them again. People say Gen X stayed off social media because they did not understand technology. That is too shallow. A better explanation is that they came from a different disclosure culture. Compared with millennials, Gen X was less comfortable leaving personal information visible online. That does not prove every Gen Xer is naturally private, but it does point to a different comfort level with exposure itself. For a lot of Gen X, visibility does not feel automatically freeing. It can feel costly. It can feel like access. It can feel like unnecessary risk. So while other people treat visibility like proof of existence, Gen X often treats restraint like control. If you want to read Gen X more accurately, watch three things: what they ignore, what they verify, and who they stay quietly loyal to over time. And here's the paradox. For all their privacy, Gen X is often extremely dependable when life gets real. They may not narrate every feeling, they may not post every act of care, but when the car dies, the deadline hits, the family goes sideways, or the crisis gets practical, they often show up with very little theater. That makes sense. This was a generation pushed toward usefulness early. So many of them learned to communicate value through function, not display. They do not always say loyalty out loud. They often prove it by handling what needs to be handled. But there is a price for becoming this self-contained. Self-reliance can harden into a private prison. The more a person is built around handling everything alone, the more complicated support can start to feel. And many Gen X adults now carry pressure in two directions at once: upward to aging parents, downward to children who still need them. That is the sandwich generation. So now you have a generation trained early not to expect too much help, carrying more than they say, and often compressing the weight instead of naming it. Strength, yes, but also compression. And that compression helps explain why Gen X can feel older than their years, not physically, but psychologically. And the world kept proving that filter right. They were young enough to absorb the instability, and old enough to keep getting tested by it. Even later, the world hit them again. The Great Recession damaged household wealth hard, especially through housing and retirement vulnerability. So, the realism you see in Gen X is not just a style choice. For many of them, reality kept reinforcing it. That is why they keep backup plans, why they respect people who can actually do something, why they do not scare easily when life gets messy, and why image alone rarely moves them for long. So by now, the pattern should be clearer. What looked like coldness was often caution. What looked like distance was often filtration. What looked like skepticism was often memory. So the real psychology of Gen X is not emotional coldness. It is earned caution. It is the mind of a generation that learned early that help might not arrive on time, that systems can disappoint you, that words and titles can be hollow, and that trust should move slower than charm. That does not make Gen X better than everyone else. It makes them specific, and once you use the right lens, it makes them legible. Gen X is not the generation of loud self-definition. It is the generation of the quiet filter, the one that watches first, tests reality second, and only then decides what and who deserves access. If you are Gen X, tell me which part of this felt unfairly accurate. And if you are not, tell me which Gen X person this suddenly made more understandable. And if this changed how you read Gen X, the next layer is understanding why calm people are so hard to control in the first place.